Well, hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Porkins Policy Radio. As always, I am your host, Pierce Redmond. You can find this podcast and more by going to porkinspolicyreview.com. Well, today we are joined by our good friend, Robbie Martin, who has, of course, joined us on the podcast several times before to discuss his epic film series, A Very Heavy Agenda. And Robbie has joined us again today to discuss the final piece, part 3, of A Very Heavy Agenda, Maintaining the World Order. Well, Robbie Martin, thanks for joining us again.
Well, thanks for having me, Pierce.
Excellent. Well, where to even start with this? This is, first off, obviously I encourage everyone to go out and watch parts 1 and 2, and then watch part 3 here. But this is a long documentary. I think it comes in almost at 3 hours in length. There's so much to talk about. So we're obviously not going to be able to get to all of it here on the podcast, and we're going to have Robbie back on again soon, hopefully. But Robbie, why don't you give us the kind of thumbnail sketch of part 3 of A Very Heavy Agenda, and perhaps sort of an overview of the whole series and what part 3 is sort of all about in terms of piecing together all of these various strands that we've discussed before on the podcast.
Well, for those of you listening out there who haven't seen part 1, 2, or 3, I'll start with like a brief overview of the whole series. And basically, it can be summed up by saying that this is an attempt to make a documentary about the Bush era neocons and sort of where they went after Bush. Sort of like, where are they now? You know, it's kind of like one of those documentaries, I guess, in a sense, but it's in a much shorter time frame because a lot of people assume that after Bush left office, a lot of these neocons sort of dropped off the map and just kind of disappeared. But what I try to show in my documentary is that they actually all were very much still dedicated to influencing foreign policy and America's war efforts. And they played a very big role in actually tipping the balance towards sort of a new Cold War posturing between NATO, the U.S., and Russia. And I sort of show this in part 1. It's sort of kind of giving you a display of the pathology of the neocons. It's mostly about their personalities, their hubris, their arrogance. There's a story in part 1. It's a lot. I'd say the story in part 1 is a lot lighter. Like there's not as many story elements that carry you. The story of part 1 is mainly that the project for the new American century that spawned all these neocons closed down and reopened under the name the Foreign Policy Initiative just in time for the Obama administration. And the rebranding of their think tank was done in essence to sort of portray their foreign policy platforms as neoliberal, as non-neocon, as something that they could actually get the Obama administration to go along with, which they did. And one of their most successful efforts in that regard was the Afghanistan surge. And 2 characters in my movie played a very prominent role in that surge who actually weren't part of the Foreign Policy Initiative. They were part of another think tank, Kim and Fred Kagan, or of course, Fred Kagan is the brother of Robert Kagan, one of the main characters in A Very Heavy Agenda. And Kim Kagan is his sister-in-law. So by the time we get around to part 3, we're already fully in the sort of new Cold War posturing, really intense situations happening in both Ukraine and Syria. We're treating Putin like the new Hitler all over the U.S. media. And part 3 sort of starts right in the middle of that. It starts sort of right after the Ukraine crisis. And but it also, and one of the things I try to do with part 1 is I try to sort of create an emotional chronology starting with 9/11, some kind of intense footage of the day of 9/11, and then taking you from that day all the way until Bush leaves office, Obama gets into office. It takes you all the way through the second term of the Obama presidency. So from part 1 and 2, I chronologically try to connect a thread between that emotional impact of 9/11, how the neocons took advantage of it, and then showing you also how they took advantage of all these other emotionally intense situations, like when the Ukraine uprising, first boiled over and the Ukrainian government stepped down. The neocons were right there trying to take advantage of that void and that emotional climate by trying to basically get the U.S. to send in to fund the Ukrainian army, and even some of the neocons wanted us to send in ground troops. So by the time we get to part 3, I sort of remind you at the beginning of part 3 of this emotional thread back to 9/11. I bring you back to 9/11 sort of again, and make people kind of walk through those emotions on 9/11 again, and then I sort of bring back anthrax, which I also tease a little bit in part 1. I don't go too much into part 1, but I try to bring it back in part 2 and show how interconnected anthrax was with 9/11. How in reality 9/11 alone wouldn't have been enough to get all of this draconian legislation, to get us pivoting towards a state of endless war, to get us to accept all this stuff. I very strongly believe that anthrax was almost required to be able to push us into this state of emotional hysteria. We needed a second attack because, as Don Kagan says in a very heavy agenda part 3, it showed this clip at the very beginning, and this is one rare instance where I agree with him, is that people will forget. He actually says, what I'm worried about is that after this day, people will think it's a one shot and that's over. But what would have happened if they would have had anthrax on this plane?
Yeah.
And that's actually not too far off from what actually did happen. Is someone sent anthrax through the mail, someone with access to a classified bioweapons facility sent out anthrax through the mail. So I believe that second attack was extremely important to getting all this in place, and Don Kagan knew that before it even happened, and a lot of neocons knew it before it even happened. That 9/11 wasn't enough. They were so greedy. They knew they needed something else. And I've already been talking for quite a long time.
No, go ahead, Robbie.
Synopsis, but just to give you a little overview of the plot of part 3. It's not just about anthrax. It's not about 9/11. I think it's important to emphasize that it's mainly about what's happening right now, and the election and Syria, and sort of how we have this reinvigorated kind of feeling of Islamophobia and the war on terror and the war against ISIS. All of these things happening right now are, the neocons aren't puppet masters controlling all of it, but they are there at every opportunity they can to sort of inch forward the dialogue and the narrative just enough so that they can keep inching it forward to a more aggressive sort of endless war posture. And in the election, this is a part of the part 3 that I didn't even really anticipate, but I try to lay this out in part 3, is that the neocons actually became so worried about Trump, even though neocons are traditionally Republican, that a lot of the prominent neocons actually have defected towards Hillary Clinton's side.
Yes.
And many of them now are supporting Hillary Clinton, which is sort of how part 3 kind of goes in that direction eventually, just showing you how they're so opportunistic. They're so ultimately disinterested in any sort of party loyalty. They're mainly interested in being able to push their endless war, U.S. hegemony sort of doctrine to anybody who will listen in D.C. And right now it's Democrats and neoliberals who are listening more so than Republicans.
Well, and that's a theme throughout the whole series, but particularly one that you pick up on in part 3 is the constant rebranding of what it means to be a neocon, what the neocon agenda is, and the people that they identify as being candidates or policymakers that will bring forth whatever this world order that they're very apt to talk about incessantly. So that's a big theme, and one I think that really you really highlight very well in this third part is that you talk about that in parts 1 and 2, and how things like the Foreign Policy Initiative and the Institute for the Study of War, these are the sort of general sort of rebranded versions of PNAC and institutions like that. But this really comes full circle, particularly when you also look at some of the historical roots of the neocon agenda, and you go all the way back to people like Irvin Kristol, who's Bill Kristol's father, who of course was he referred to himself as a neo-Marxist, neo-Trotskyite, who eventually would go on to be the godfather of the neoconservative agenda. But that those links, those historical links, going all the way back, and how again we see people like Hillary Clinton, who would, I guess, describe herself, or people would describe her as a quote unquote liberal, but of course she is very much a neocon and fits into that particular worldview. So again, very interesting, the historical sort of background to a lot of this. Also some of the roots, you talk about throughout part 3, there are little sprinklings of mentions of Iran-Contra. And of course, many of these people go back to Iran-Contra. That might be one of the first sort of instances where neocons were in power and were doing things behind the scenes in government. You talk about, Robert Kagan's book, A Twilight Struggle, which is all about Reagan's war in Nicaragua. And of course, what I guess he does mention it, but during that time, of course, Kagan worked for the U.S. Information Agency, which oversees things like RFERL and Voice of America. Kagan received lots of dirty money from Iran-Contra to fund propaganda operations. And some of this money, as you point out, came directly from Oliver North's secret slush fund. And of course, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, we'll get to that a little bit later, when you start talking about the hipster propaganda. But it's no surprise that these are all sort of interrelated. But one thing I kind of wanted to get your initial take on, Robbie, and something I think we'll explore a little bit later, but is this, it really becomes clear in part 3, is that while the neocons, their heyday, many would assume was during the George W. Bush's reign, 2003 especially, with Iraq and all these things. Then they kind of like fall off a little bit, but now they're sort of back again. But what I really appreciate with the Very Heavy Agenda is you really kind of lift the curtain behind what people call the deep state or the shadow elite. And that's a term that gets bandied about quite a bit, and I think people kind of lose the meaning of it. And then the deep state becomes this sort of all-encompassing, it's the CIA and NATO and the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Committee and the Federal Reserve. And while all those things are part of it, I think what's really fascinating that I want to kind of get your perspective on is just particularly the neocons as one very powerful element of the deep state. And they are this very small, really, when you get down to it, the Kagans, Bill Kristol, a few other like Dan Senior and Elliot Abrams, they really represent a faction of the deep state. But Robbie, I just wanted to kind of get your take on the idea of the neocons as a deep state and the fact that they are very small and yet they are able to influence policy decisions on a level that we could have never imagined. So what do you think their sort of legacy as part of the deep state will become?
That's a good question. I mean, I think, well, it is. I mean, first, I just want to say it's very scary to me how few people this actually takes. How you mentioned how few of these neocons there are, and that kind of makes you wonder. Well, how are they able? They can't possibly be, controlling all these situations, and they're not. That's not really how it works. I think what's a really important angle to this is it's almost like at this point in time, and it's been this way for a while, is that these very small group of neocons know and understand that them alone one would not be able to tip the balance of these sort of important, pushes for war. Maybe when they were out there during the Bush administration, they felt a little more comfortable, sort of going out there alone and putting out some more kind of more aggressive rhetoric than they maybe put out now. But I think now they're very comfortable relying on an engine of sort of Democrat and neoliberal sort of people who have this sort of humanitarian, this quasi-humanitarian neoliberalism where they believe in American exceptionalism. And they believe that American exceptionalism, is so important that when when another nation, like Syria, for example, after the Assad allegedly crossed the red line, that is a humanitarian thing to do, and that it's our duty to take out Assad. That's not even really you can't even say that's a neocon point of view anymore, because it really is mostly a neoliberal sort of point of view of the overall foreign policy kind of doctrine in Washington, D.C. It is bipartisan. It's shared among most Republicans and Democrats. And what the neocons do is they're able to plant the seed sort of within those groups and within that mindset. But I think more importantly, they always need to put in a little bit of a humanitarian angle, a little bit of liberal spice into their mix to get that sort of engine and that fuel to activate for them. Because without it, it just sounds hawkish. It just sounds militaristic. That's why they don't like Trump, because he's removing sort of the liberal humanitarian, the quasi-humanitarian, spice, paint job from it. And he's just taking the hawkish, like, we just need to bomb the shit out of him kind of approach.
Yeah.
But for the neocons, they understand that they always have to put in a humanitarian angle. And that's why I think when you argue against neocons, you can't argue from, you have to undermine their entire framework, because then, it's like overthrowing Saddam. It's like, well, they'll say, what, you didn't want to overthrow Saddam? He killed, would you rather see Saddam there? So there's all these ways they box people in. But in terms of their sort of what part of the deep state, apparatus they are, I mean, I think it's pretty evident to me that these people, especially the neocons, are the best lobbyists in the United States, at least, for the military-industrial complex. And that almost sounds like it's an oversimplification to call them lobbyists, because they're not. I mean, they're not lobbyists like an actual lobbyist in D.C. would be a lobbyist. They're, in my opinion, much more important than a typical lobbyist, because they create the philosophical and intellectual underpinnings for the sales pitch. The sales pitch itself can be a little more dumbed down, but the actual framework, which they create, and that begs the question, what role are they actually playing? Are they, is this a sort of a deep state apparatus that's designed to like be an outside agitating force to get different departments in the U.S. government to to do things or to make certain moves? It's hard for me to say, but I definitely think that Kagan have their fingers in many of these pies. To me, their legacy, their level of involvement, their connections to so many of these different things, it is very curious and does raise a lot of questions about what their actual role is. Is Robert Kagan simply just this editorialist, or is he playing some sort of deeper role? I mean, as a young man, he was doing propaganda for Ronald Reagan, and arguably he's been doing it ever since. He's just been doing it in a different form and under different, wrapping paper, basically. Oh
yeah, and I think sometimes there's a desire in the alt media or the conspiracy culture to see that the deep state it's this amorphous group and it's difficult to pin down. Whereas, you point out throughout the movie, just you have like a shot of the Institute for the Study of War, their like About Us page, and at the bottom it's all brought to you by Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Palantir, all these groups. They're actually fairly open about all of this. They're not really hiding behind very much. It's no secret that Robert Kagan's wife is Victoria Nuland, and that both of them are very influential on both sides of the aisle. The same with Fred Kagan and Kimberly Kagan. They're very open about the influence that they have, and the fact that you have them being advisors to Petraeus while they're being funded to come up with particular statistics or maps by the arms company. So it's interesting, it's when you kind of take a step back and you see there's a writer that you have several interview clips up who wrote a book called The Shadow Elite, and I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but she points out the same thing. This is they're not really hiding. They're all right there in front of you. It's just that people are either lazy or don't seem to see that these are conflicts of interest. Or it is a conflict of interest, but whatever, who cares? That's just the way it works.
Yeah.
But shifting around a little bit, because it again, this rebranding of neocon ideas, because when you strip it down and you really you get, say, a Robert Kagan, or you have some interviews with Michael Ledeen, who's really terrifying. When you kind of just really get, straight down and they really start kind of talking what the, bare bones, what this is about, it is this psychotic, violent, Michael Ledeen uses the term messianic crusade or whatever, to have perpetual warfare, to have America be the ultimate superpower. You have some clips where Robert Kagan essentially says international law is nothing because we violate it all the time. So who even really cares about it? We should promote it, in the sense that, because we'll use it against the quote unquote bad guys, but it doesn't really apply to us.
Yeah.
So when you really kind of, ask them point blank, they'll be quite candid about the fact that, yeah, of course, we need perpetual war, that this is all good, that, we should be spending more on our defense budget because, I think it's, who is it? I think it's Fred Kagan is talking about how, well, yes, China, doesn't spend that much, but China is only concerned with Asia. We're concerned with the whole world. So, of course, we need to double our already massive defense budget. But past that, there is also this desire that you've picked up on throughout this series that the neocons also need to kind of appeal to everybody in whatever way they can. And whereas, say, in the during George W. Bush's administration, it was very much about appealing to the conservative hard right, pro-Israel and anti-terrorism and all those that's what that was about. And they couldn't really get, say, the liberals or the Democrats on board. But now, of course, we've seen that change. And you have a section in the film called Hipster Propaganda. And this is a really interesting sort of a section in the movie because it breaks down how they're able to take this apocalyptic worldview where it's all about murdering everybody and, arms companies taking over the world, but they, water it down and they're able to, I guess, kind of indoctrinate the hipster community or, young quote unquote liberals into believing this stuff. And you talk quite a bit about the rise of Vice magazine, which I think we talked about when we talked about part 2 of this. And I think we even talked about it on your show, but break this down for us a little bit, because again, we've got Vice magazine is now $1 billion a year company. They're Rupert Murdoch is heavily invested. Disney, I think, owns now 10% of Vice magazine. We've got a former Obama administration official is the COO of Vice magazine, and talk about this sort of trajectory and how the neocons got so embedded within hipster culture, because it's a really fascinating thing. And again, if you go back and you look at early interviews of Shane Smith or particularly Gavin McGinnis, two of the founders of Vice magazine, they're pretty upfront, particularly Gavin McGinnis, about how this whole thing was about turning people into these little neocons, basically.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of a lot of interesting points you raised. So I'll try to address all of them if I can remember all of them. But I'll start by addressing the last thing you said. Is when you actually look at Gavin McGinnis now, and this is not just simply some random guy who was involved in the founding of Vice. He, by his own admission, and Shane Smith has never disputed this, was primarily responsible for the main vision and all of the content in the magazine. Shane Smith was the marketing guy, the business guy. Gavin McGinnis was the culture guy, the point of view guy. Gavin McGinnis was the one responsible for, putting all the very strongly sexual content in the magazine. The stuff that, by almost any definition, is sort of excusing rape culture in a hipster paradigm, which is kind of a creepy thing. If you read back to a lot of older issues of Vice, there's a lot of stuff with Terry Richardson in there. In fact, I didn't even know who Terry Richardson was until Vice. And there's many credible cases out there that Terry Richardson is a serial rapist, who's essentially his photography business exists as a cover for raping and coercing underage girls into having sex with him. So this is something that Vice was built on from the very beginning, is sort of this almost like a proto-alt-right, I would argue. And Gavin McGinnis, of course, now is like a figurehead of the alt-right movement, which is the alt-right, in case anybody listening doesn't know what it is, it's sort of almost like a right-wing, contrarian, young person version of, what used to be sort of more right-wing conservatism that sort of almost spawned out of 4chan, Reddit. It's sort of like internet trolling mixed with right-wing politics. And Gavin McGinnis totally embodies that now and is proudly sort of a figurehead of it. But you can see this thread going back throughout the very beginning of Vice. They write articles, it's just really interesting how many things actually they were able to get away with that are clearly like weird alt-right, conservative, like anti-liberal points of view. That nobody really called them out on because everything else about their magazine was so seemingly liberal and open and edgy, and also questionably free. Their magazine was free. And that's a part that I'm still investigating, is why and how would a very glossy, very expensively printed magazine able to be free for so long before it really, took off completely. That part to me is a little bit bizarre, more than a little bit. But of course, I throw in a clip in my movie showing how Shane Smith is like, oh yeah, we aired a free-to-air, block of programming in Eastern Europe, as like a test pilot program. It's like, why? Why did you do that? Why Eastern Europe during 2014 when NATO is ramping up in a way that they haven't ramped up since the Cold War? Like, is that just you doing this for fun? So there's all these questions that, I can't answer accurately. I can only speculate. But I raise plenty of them in the movie that in some way, form or another. And the only thing I would disagree with what you said in your original question was the sort of the neocon influence over this hipster propaganda. I think that Vice is almost like the trickle down effect of what you see from that neocon influence. And I would argue places like BuzzFeed and Daily Beast are actually more directly injected with neocon propaganda, like from the top down. Now, I see Vice as almost something maybe even more insidious, where at some point in time, it did seem like the White House itself, sort of the neoliberal Democrat faction in DC, but the White House actually created a channel, like a communication channel between them and Vice, giving them exclusive access to things, having Biden coming to visit their studios, which is not highly unusual for a vice president to come visit a TV studio. What is unusual is that Vice made a point in their special to make it seem cool that Joe Biden was visiting. CNN doesn't show you behind the scenes footage of Anderson Cooper smiling like a giddy schoolgirl hugging Joe Biden. CNN is actually understands that that's not that showing that type of journalism to the public is not good. They're smart enough to understand that. Vice is actually setting a new precedent where it's like, hey guys, look, it's rad to hang out with Obama. It's fucking cool to like give a hug to Joe Biden and sit in our studios and talk to Joe Biden about how Putin is Hitler. This is super rad, guys. Oh, and state-funded media, we're not going to say the name RT, but we'll just hint at it. All that state-funded media, that's garbage propaganda. Check out our shit. I mean, that's kind of what they're saying. I have several clips of Shane Smith in my movie not using the word RT, but he is talking about RT at several points in time and kind of mocking it and saying how it's at Cold War level. It's just all this anti-American rhetoric. Well, his company is putting out some of the most anti-Russian manipulative bullshit that I've ever seen. And it's directed towards young people who aren't that political. And I think that ties into another thing that you brought up earlier, that Irving Kristol is a key figure to understanding a lot of this, because he pleads ignorance. He's I don't know how old he was during that interview, probably in his late 70s. That late into his life, he still pleads ignorance that he did not know that a liberal magazine he was writing in the 60s was funded by the CIA and was a CIA front. He claims ignorance. He says he was annoyed that he didn't know that he was being funded by the CIA. But when you read a lot about Encounter magazine and why the CIA was funding it, William Blum, another great author who wrote this amazing book, Killing Hope, that I recommend everybody check out if you haven't heard of it. It's basically a chronology of every military engagement that we've been involved in since World War I, including all the CIA secret wars too. He goes through all of it. But William Blum, he's done research into Encounter also, and he was just like, look, this is basically even more important than getting the American population was already well divided. Right-wing people, conservatives were fairly okay with the Cold War. It wasn't like hard to get right-wing conservatives in America to go along with the Cold War. It was very much tied to, anti-communism was very much tied to the American identity, national identity. What was more important is the CIA and other sort of state actors wanted to get liberals to get behind the Cold War. And especially not just liberals, but people who they described as Cold War, they called it Cold War neutralism. So people who didn't care, especially people in Europe who didn't care, who didn't have a dog in the fight, who just didn't really care much about the Cold War. That was really important for them to try to change those people's minds. And I think that you can see a very clear parallel between Vice and what that is doing, because Vice is hitting a contingent of young people who really don't give much of a shit about Russia and Ukraine at all, who don't give much of a shit about Syria, who don't care about ISIS, but they're making them care. And that's a really fascinating thing to me. And they're not making them care about it in a way that gives them a greater education or a deeper context or a greater level of understanding about NATO or Ukraine. They're actually pushing them and trying to tip them over in the direction of neoconservative belief system, of just believing that Putin is this evil new Hitler-like figure, that he is dangerous to the world, that we need to overthrow Assad, that ISIS is this radical Islamic terroristic force that is so dangerous and so evil that liberalism, if you were a liberal, you can't stand for that. I mean, they are pushing you in these directions. And because of that, I see Vice as almost more dangerous than places like the Daily Beast and BuzzFeed that have literal neocon, shills writing for them, like Rosie Gray for BuzzFeed, Miriam Elder for BuzzFeed, Max Sedon for BuzzFeed, all total neocon shills. Many of them came straight from Washington Free Beacon, which is a neoconservative outlet started by a Georgian lobbyist named Michael Goldfarb. So it's just, I could go into so much more detail, but I'll just end my rant about Vice there. I see it as very dangerous because it's pushing people who are apolitical into this sort of bullshit, sort of American exceptionalist political direction.
No, I would completely agree with you. I think when you look at, like Josh Rogan or who's his crony, the
Eli Lake.
Yeah. They're you kind of know where they stand. They're a little bit more comfortable with the term neocon, or at least they're identified like that. Whereas, as you said, with Vice, it's I think they're tapping into, again, this, sad to say, but this sort of apolitical, I don't really care about whatever in the world. I just like Vice magazine, and they're tapping into that, and they're turning all of them into these rabid anti-Russian, we've got to kill all of ISIS. It's like you could take what they're saying and apply it to a Donald Trump or a Marco Rubio or Hillary Clinton, and it wouldn't seem out of context for them to be saying that. But yeah, because it's Vice, because it's sort of marketed as this cool, hip alternative magazine, people don't really see that. And I really love the whole connection. When you look at something like Encounter magazine and Irving Kristol, again, who was a quote liberal back then, writing for this, and I don't buy for a second he didn't know that the CIA was funding them. And then it's funny, in that interview, he says that he was pissed off, but then he said, I didn't really care at the end.
Yeah.
You know, whatever. Yeah, okay, sure, CIA. I mean, it's still writing great articles back then. So yeah, it's very interesting, that connection and the possible connection with Vice. And then, of course, too, I mean, Vice is, they've cozied up to Elliot Higgins at the Atlantic Council. It's just a NATO think tank. George Soros, they have him reading some stupid fucking speech. And then, of course, Vice will use RFERL, Voice of America. They'll use all of those things. They'll never say that they are state-funded propaganda outlets. They'll just mention them. And then you have a whole clip in the movie where you have the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which took over for the U.S. Information Agency, Robert Kagan's former employer, and they love Vice, and they mention them, constantly in their auditing reports. And then, again, and then you take these so-called liberal heroes like Bill Maher or Fareed Zakaria, who's sort of, again, one of these supposedly intellectual kind of globalist people, and they're both, executive producers at Vice. They're heavily involved. Maher is an executive producer. And again, he, all those clips where he's pimping out Vice, he's saying, these are the fucking coolest, crazy guys out there, and they go to the heart of the action. And, Shane Smith goes and fights alongside the Libyan rebels. And of course, what Shane Smith never says is that the so-called rebels that he was filming were the same ones locking up black Libyans, torturing them, these people that, that sodomized Gaddafi. And again, Shane Smith is so fucking transparent when it comes to, he boasts about we're going to be bigger than CNN. I don't understand how that's supposed to be hip. To become like CNN, or again it's hip to hug the president and basically just parrot CIA and NATO talking points when you're just constantly quoting from RFERL. But as you say in the film, Vice was able to do what Fox couldn't, and that was reach out and convince young liberals that they had to hate Muslims, Russia, and that the fear of terrorism everywhere. That's most of Vice's very much taps into that kind of doom and gloom media campaign or marketing campaign, where everything is just sort of it's negative and horrible. And then of course they spice that up with, no matter where they go, they always find like the one coke dealer, in all of whatever Nigeria or something. They wherever they go, they always manage to find drugs or shots of topless women or something like that. So again, tapping into that sort of childlike male, I don't know, childlike boy in so many of their readers. But very fascinating the way that they're able to kind of take all those things and essentially just convince a whole group of people that this is all totally cool. This is all great. But getting off Vice, because I think me and you could probably bitch and moan about Vice for several podcasts, and we already have before on previous shows. What about because again, what I really loved about part 3 was you really did just sort of go through, so you look at the intellectual side, you look at the sort of rise of this sort of new media class, and then you also shift again to this presidential election that is just seemingly unending and keeps going on. What happened with the neocons and with this particular presidential election cycle? Because obviously they all loved Marco Rubio, who is a robot for all intents and purposes, who will just it's you almost picture them like jamming a flash drive into the back of his head, giving him some talking points, and then he just goes up and says them. What happened with the neocons and the GOP election cycle this year? Because again, you talk about Rand Paul, who for all of his foibles, and there are many, he did briefly for a time at the beginning of this race, he would use the term neocon, and he would call out people for using neocon slogans and talking points. And all of the GOP candidates, you have tons of footage, they're all saying the exact same thing. Like they must have all gotten a memo from foreign policy initiatives to, okay, this is what you got to say this week. So what's your take on this? And again, the fact that they've all distanced themselves now from Donald Trump, despite the fact that he basically agrees with, or would agree with him on it. I mean, Trump doesn't really believe in anything, so I'm sure they could convince him, to follow neocon talking points. But what's your take on was this sort of like a misstep on behalf of the neocons? Did they really think they could have gone all the way with Rubio?
I think that there was a lot of I definitely think that when the candidate spread first appeared, there were a lot of neocons who were probably fairly confident that, and I think they were confident going into the election, not because of necessarily who all the candidates were, but more that the climate in the country had regressed to a more infantile emotional state of basically being ready for war again and wanting and having that sort of bloodthirst against Muslims and against radical Islamic terrorists. If you reverse, you go back 8 years, was it 8 years or no? I guess 4 years previous, the debates between Mitt Romney and Obama, there was hardly any foreign policy to be discussed during that election. That just shows you how far we've come in 4 years, that now we're sort of, they're talking about carpet bombing the Middle East, bringing back waterboarding. I mean, we've really regressed and gone back to almost sort of this post, this 9/12 sort of emotional mind state in a lot of ways, simply because of ISIS has captivated our attention. And then, of course, when you throw in the mix of the new Cold War, that's, of course, making people dumber, more emotional, more fearful, more reactive. So I think that to the neocons, all those elements were great for them because those are the elements that they always want. They're always hoping those elements will be there, because the more we're thrown off our game as the public, the more emotionally confused and in a cloud we are, the easier it is for them to just steamroll over us, and to get their shit in play. So I think when they were coming in, they were like, great. So many of these candidates are saying all the things that we want them to say. We have at least 3 candidates who are very neoconservative: Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, trying to think of who the other ones. Ted Cruz is almost like, he was almost trying to play both sides, where he was trying to appeal to the neoconservatives and the Tea Partiers at the same time. Like, he actually got in a fight at one point in the debates with Rubio, where Rubio was like, well, to carpet bomb the Middle East, we need to be able to get the money to it. And like, you're such an anti-big government guy, you don't want to spend the money. And then another time, Marco Rubio said we should be able to attack ISIS without congressional approval. And Ted Cruz said, no, we need congressional approval, because he was still trying to play that libertarian, government accountability side. So that's interesting that, there had all these like mini squabbles that were really meaningless. And, you see Elliot Abrams, one of the Iran-Contra criminals who got pardoned, advising Ted Cruz and Rubio. You have Paul Wolfowitz advising Jeb Bush. You have Dan Senor and Eric Edelman advising Marco Rubio. I think Dan Senor also advised Jeb Bush. So there's so much crossover, and essentially some of these same neocons are advising multiple candidates at once. So it's almost like they're betting, they're spreading their luck across a field, and they never took Trump seriously. And I think that, you asked did they misstep? I think that was their biggest misstep. They did not take Trump seriously enough going into this, and they figured, oh, well, their candidates that they're getting behind are really hawkish. So it's not like Donald Trump is going to say something like more hawkish, or, he's going to be more to the right with them on foreign policy. But what Donald Trump did that they didn't expect is Donald Trump, he did actually in some ways go more to the right in his military posturing, more aggressive sounding, but then he removed that component that the neocons want so badly, which is sort of this, why we need to engage ourselves in multiple Middle Eastern wars. Instead, Trump was saying, we just need to bomb the shit out of them and then like get out and then like worry about our stuff here and make America great again. Where the neocons actually have a world domination sort of theme that goes along with their hawkishness, where they want to remake the world in their image, or that's what they claim. That they want to overthrow all these Middle Eastern dictators because they're not democratic, and we need them to have American values. And I think that's one of the things that the neocons messed up the worst on, is they did not anticipate that Trump would not just be equally as hawkish as all their favorites, but then also use their rhetoric essentially against them to deflate that, their reasons for being hawkish. And I think that it was a perfect climate too, because it was like this sort of social conservatism, this sort of Tea Party fiscal conservatism of wanting to take care of ourselves here and not spend money overseas. All that stuff was sort of reaching a boiling point, and Trump just came in and he used all that energy and was just like, yeah, like we don't want to wage endless wars, but he's not saying it from like a humanitarian or an anti-war perspective. He's saying it from like that national identity sort of conservatism. We need to protect ourselves here, And another thing is, I don't think the neocons ever wanted the xenophobia that they put out there, because arguably the neocons were using Islamophobia as a tool. I don't think that the neocons ever wanted Islamophobia to get to the point of people wanting to ban Muslims from immigrating into the United States. I don't think that was ever their intention. But what Trump did again is he used their own rhetoric against them and sort of sucked the wind out of their sails by saying, oh, well, we are this afraid of Muslims. We need to stop them from coming to the country. The neocons only wanted to inject Islamophobia in order to get us to dehumanize all the people we were killing across the world. And I think that they largely succeeded in doing that. Trump took it even a step further. But then by doing that, he's pulling away from sort of that neocon posturing. And I think that's very interesting, that the neocons didn't even anticipate that, and their hatred towards him and their dislike of him, I don't even think is because they think he's anti-war. I think it's because he's taking the wind out of their sails, using their own rhetoric and twisting it against them, taking away their power, and B, they know that by turning against him right now and sort of shifting themselves more to the liberal side is the perfect means to rebrand themselves yet again for this next 8-year cycle, just like they did when Obama first got into office. I mean, the foreign policy initiative was clearly an attempt to reach across the aisle to the Democrats to influence Obama, and they're doing it once again. But I would say this time the rebranding is maybe even more drastic, because now they're openly supporting Hillary Clinton for president, whereas before they were supporting
policies of Obama.
Exactly, and they were supporting McCain during the 2008 election. They supported Romney during the 2008 election, but they still cheered Obama on for the first 4 years of his presidency in Libya, in Afghanistan. It wasn't until really the Syria red line reversal where Obama backed down on that, and then he pulled troops out of Iraq, did they totally flip out and start kind of turning on him. But yeah, I think the election in general, I mean, it's unprecedented in so many ways, but I think in one of the big ways, the neocons are completely switching party allegiance in this election cycle, and that's going to be something. It'll be really interesting to see how that plays out, in the years to come. I can't really say, but I do think that Hillary Clinton will bring back Bob Kagan somehow into her administration, and his wife Victoria Nuland, and Fred and Kim Kagan. One thing I didn't put into my movie is that Fred and Kim Kagan had visited the Obama White House multiple times. It's in the logs. One of the things Obama did when he got into office for this promise of transparency is you can now look up who visits the White House, and all the Kagans visit the White House multiple times. Yeah. So, and this is not just like visiting with, a staffer, it's visiting with Obama.
Right. No, and I think that's a point that comes across particularly in part 3, is that really at the heart of it, there's a big point, and Irving Kristol was one to say ideas matter, and they certainly do. And that is, the neoconservatives, it's an idea. It's not like a political affiliation or anything. It's just an idea, and those ideas can change over time. But it's so funny. I think that on another level, the basic, ideologies and even the basic ideas don't even really matter to the neocons because, as you say, they're out front and center. Day after 9/11, you got Fred and Donald Kagan on Milt Rosenberg's show talking about how, it was the Palestinians that were responsible for 9/11 and that really, Palestine is hiding Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah, who are apparently, according to them, working together for some reason. And it's all about the Muslims and all this shit. But then they will, when Trump picks that up and goes kind of balls to the wall, suddenly it's, you would think that they were the most sort of pro-Muslim policymakers out there.
Yeah.
So I think it's just like, it just sort of illustrates again that they don't really care about the nuts and bolts of some of these things. I mean, there are prominent Muslims that are neocons.
Absolutely.
The former ambassador to Afghanistan, of course, who introduced Trump. But I think it just sort of it shows or it illustrates the fact that they don't really care about specifics. They really are just concerned with being in power and continuing perpetual warfare. As you said, to put it in a very simplistic sort of bullet point, because they're funded by the arms companies. This is essentially who's paying their bills. So it behooves them to, of course, continue war and to continue the idea that America is this sort of dominant superpower. That's all they really care about. I mean, they would have gone after anybody. Exactly. They would have easily blamed, if it was easier at the time to blame 9/11 on a Timothy McVeigh Patriot group, then that's who the bad guy would have been.
Exactly. That's the thing I try to get people. A lot of people have asked me after making this, like, what is their goal? And I don't think it's as concrete as like a normal, it's not like a strategic goal in the sense like they want to landlock Russia or they want to like surround, Iran. I think it is what you just said. It's more symbolic to them. That's the goal. The posture, the symbolism of America being on top and being there as sort of a warning, like you don't fuck with us. Like we'll fuck you up. That's, I mean, on a base level, that's what they want. That's their goal. They want that to always remain true. And in any way that slips or, if that seems to be going, backwards, they're there right there to try to push it forwards again. So that's why when they saw Obama, backing down from a few of these things, they got terrified that this, the next 4 years of this presidency could do enormous damage to that symbolism that they had worked so hard to prop up. And I think that, in a little tiny way, as awful and as terrible as Obama has been on foreign policy, I think at a certain point in time, he understood some of what we're talking about now. Even in his warped neoliberal, naive mind state, I'm sure that he felt some of this pressure. And the red line, I think, is a great example of how the neocons were able to box everybody in, including neoliberals, to be like, well, look, he crossed the red line. Yeah. Now we need to attack. He gassed his own people. I mean, think of the pressure that Obama must have been feeling to not go along with that at the time. I mean, it's actually kind of shocking when you think that he didn't go along with that. After all the attempts and the maneuvers to box him in, it's almost like there's no excuse he could have made at that point to not do it. And then the deal he ended up striking was was with Putin to like remove chemical weapons from Syria. I don't know if that ever happened, but it was something so egregious to the neocons that they were just like, okay, this is it. Like we have to do everything we can now to stop this mindset. And then even, there's even a lot of argument to be made that John Kerry and some of the other people in Obama's administration have actually tried to undermine him at different areas with this and tried to push him. John Kerry was actually really upset at this Syria deal. And sort of the early quotes and leaks that came out about his sort of feelings about it were very negative towards Obama. but who knows? A lot of those kinds of articles were written by people like Josh Rogan and Eli Lake, like sort of the internal rifts. So who knows if those were sort of planted out there to almost create these internal rifts, So it gets very convoluted, but I do think that, and I have some other criticisms about Glenn Greenwald and other people like him, but this is one I've never really voiced before, and I'll voice it now, is that I think that some of Glenn Greenwald's approach towards the Obama administration and some of the other like really harsh critics of Obama early on did a disservice to what was like to the actual reality of what was happening. Yes, Obama is, the buck stops with him. Yes, he is the president, but I think that people like Glenn Greenwald did a really good job of omitting sort of this larger story of how all these neocons were sort of surrounding his administration and also inside of it. And then sort of the dynamic that was playing out inside the administration and how Obama was really naive and was sort of like inexperienced. He didn't and I think that was a great opportunity for these neocons. I don't know, how they looked at him compared to Bush, but I definitely think at first they thought it was a great opportunity for them, especially in that 4 years. And Glenn Greenwald painted Obama as just another neocon. He's a neocon, and he's doing all these neocon things. But I think it's a little, it's way more nuanced than that. And I think that when you look back at the Obama administration, when I do now, I see it much differently than I did when he first got in, where it was just like, oh my God, he's just continuing all these Bush policies, which he was. But I think there's a more interesting story there, I guess, to be told, I think. And then maybe somebody will tell it eventually. Maybe Obama will when he gets out of office. I don't know if I would believe his version of it. But there was a lot of interesting shit happening and a lot of disagreement. And, that team of rivals that he claimed to have put in when he got into office, I mean, it really was in some ways, but they were really all rivaling in a lot of ways against him and against his sort of phony anti-war stance. And I think that they succeeded in, molding Obama into this neoliberal, almost like neocon. American exceptionalism is the way. But, it seems like he is kind of reversed a little bit on that just in the last couple of years, but it's not really going to matter now because, as I show in my movie, the House already overwhelmingly voted to send the Ukrainian army weapons twice. Actually, I think 3 times, and Obama just didn't send the weapons yet. He already signed it into law, but for some reason he didn't send them. Now, that's just foot dragging to me. So whoever's in there next is going to send the weapons. I mean, it's not even really a question. There's no reason why they wouldn't. They go in, their first day is in the Oval Office, they look at all these pending bills and they'd be like, oh, why wasn't this done yet? Oh, okay, let's do this one. Let's do this one. I mean, it's like they would have to almost go through the whole process again to understand maybe what mind state Obama used to not send the weapons, So I don't know. It almost sounds like I'm defending Obama. I'm really not. I'm just trying to show how there's maybe a little bit more nuance with what happened.
No, I completely agree. I think that's, again, there's always a knee-jerk reaction to, especially in the alternative community, you can't like any president, unless it's Trump. We're not supposed to like any president or any politician, but Trump is different for whatever fucking reason. The same way that Ron Paul or Cynthia McKinney or Dennis Kucinich, or Bernie Sanders or Gary Johnson, who embarrassingly I voted for the last election. But I think that there, as you said, there's so much more nuance to this, and something that I sort of had toyed around with the theory, and then certainly after watching your film that kind of became more cemented, is that I think that, going back again historically, looking at some of the roots of the neocons, and we of course we go back to things like Iran-Contra, where you get this small group of guys that all kind of rise to power within the administration, and also within the CIA, within the military and the intelligence community. And they have a pretty good run up until, let's say, the end of the George W. Bush administration, when then it becomes sort of unfashionable to be a neocon. And very much, I think that Obama is not a creation of the CIA, but certainly that was their guy. That's who, Obama worked for the law firm for the CIA. I think he is he was a favorable candidate for the CIA. And he comes into power, and what is he kind of more into is what the CIA is more into, these covert things. We'll do drone strikes, we'll fund small rebel jihadi groups. We'll kind of do this sort of with a facade that we're being open. Then, of course, Obama turns out to be the least transparent president out there. And then the second that he, kind of falters, with Syria, then the neocons say, "Oh, this is our entrance. This is how we get back into power." And then suddenly they just pop out of everywhere. They all hate Obama. They're all, openly supporting Rubio or Ted Cruz or as you said, people like Hillary Clinton, John Kerry. There's just a recent article about, I think it was Philip Breedlove, former NATO commander, was, more involved in, is really vocal and hated. So I think in a lot of ways with Obama coming in, this is my own pet theory, this is very much the CIA kind of cleaning up their house a little bit. They got rid of a lot of these sort of more influential neocons that had, again, come from all the way from Iran-Contra up to really becoming quite powerful with Bush. And again, Bush was just kind of an empty suit. He would do and say pretty much whatever he was told. That's how I think. And I think Obama is the same way, too. I'm sure, when he became president, I'm sure he sat down with some, guys we've never heard of before who, told him, well, this is basically what's going to happen. But again, you exercise anything or just a little bit. And suddenly the all these little rats come out of the woodwork and start attacking you. So, yeah, I agree with you. Not to defend him at all, but I think there's a bigger, like anything like this, any deep state event or something, there's always a little bit more. And I think there are, I think he genuinely didn't want to necessarily go to all out war. Because what's he done since then is he's just sort of increased the kind of stuff that the CIA has always been more comfortable with, special forces, sending in small groups of CIA agents, destabilization, the sort of constant low intensity warfare that's obviously gotten more intense. Whereas the neocons want, 15,000 troops occupying Palestine to root out whatever, Osama bin Laden or something. That's what they want. They want this sort of overt, in-your-face kind of thing. And again, that I think when they rose to power within organizations like the CIA, we saw the CIA take a much more in-your-face approach. And now, of course, people are much more aware of who the CIA director is. Or the CIA director has a much more sort of, like the CIA is on Twitter now, this would be like anathema several years ago. You look at older, spies like MI6 or something. They only sort of recently acknowledged that they exist. And obviously they have this fucking huge building on the Thames, but they would always sort of deny that they existed as an organization. Whereas now we see the CIA is, they do, to plug my other podcast that Robbie was also on, they're involved in Hollywood. So I think you're right to say that there's more to that story. And again, too, it's within the alt community. It's Obama is to blame for everything. Yet, we tend to discourage people on voting because the president doesn't really matter. So it's sort of like having it both ways. But one other thing I wanted to kind of get to, and I think it kind of brings it all together, and it's an interesting idea that you bring up in the film, is again that there's sort of a lot of this seems to have kind of gotten a little bit out of the neocons' hands. When you see people like a Donald Trump, for instance, who basically just takes their ideas and kind of runs with it to a sort of scary level. But there's a really great interview that you have up, and it's Donald Kagan, who's the senior Kagan, and I believe it's when he's referring to Irving Kristol and what he taught him, and he says that Kristol taught him the importance of the relationship between foreign policy domestic
he was talking about what Robert taught him.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, Robert. Okay, yes, yeah. Right. What Robert taught him, and he says it's the importance of the relationship between foreign policy, domestic policy, and the media, and that these are all intertwined. And I just kind of wanted to flesh that out a little bit, because it's very, and again, it's interesting because that's essentially what so many of the GOP candidates are doing, and I think Trump really kind of embodies this, because he takes a domestic issue, immigration, and combines it with foreign policy. So apparently, it's not really, the Mexicans are bad because they're rapists and they're stealing our jobs. But the real problem is all those Muslims that are immigrating that are going to, that are really ISIS terrorists. And of course, the alternative media loves Donald Trump and they love feeding into those things. But that is also, the same case. Rubio and Ted Cruz said the same sort of crap about immigration and how it, I don't know, ISIS is going to come over and blow up power plants on the Texas-Mexico border. And of course, they get tons of airtime on Fox or The Blaze or a lot of AM talk radio. So talk a little bit about that, Robbie, because it's a very interesting concept. And again, I think it also goes to show that when it comes to the deep state, it's really only a few people. You look at the Kagan family, and they obviously influence foreign policy. By extension, they're influencing domestic policy. They're changing the way we live domestically. And they're also very linked to the media. When you talk about the Institute for the Study of War, is the media's go-to person or group for maps and things like that. So flesh that out a little bit.
Yeah, that quote from Don Kagan I thought was extremely revealing, because it's something that we probably already all feel about these neocons and some of the more clever and crafty ones. But he spells it out that that this is an extremely important dynamic that happens in this country. That basically, one way to interpret what he's saying is that to sell wars and to sell foreign policy endeavors, we basically need to have a political sort of energy, I guess like an energy domestically sort of to capture, because without that, it would be almost just like trying to sell a war in a vacuum. You almost need something happening domestically to sort of ride along with it. And that doesn't mean that something has to be like actually happening. It just means that you have to create the perception of some sort of domestic issue. And I think that that's why they hate, that's really the main reason why they hate Trump so much, is because in a lot of ways he's been able to do that better than the neocons. He's been able to put it at a more visceral level, because the thing that the neocons rely on is they almost rely on like attacks, like at this point in time, it almost to me seems like the neocons' fuel is if an Islamic terrorist attack happens, or if Russia does something particularly tyrannical in their own country, like if they lock up like pussy, like if they locked up another punk band or something. Yeah. So it's those kind of things that the neocons seize on, and the only reason I bring up Pussy Riot, that was a mostly reflected on the policies in Russia. But if you really think about it, that was a very important sort of like cultural thing here, where we really all stood behind Pussy Riot and, really wanted this like punk band, should never be put in jail, like they like you can do that over here and not be put in jail. Like, why should people in Russia not be able to do that and, be like innocent or, free? So I think the three-way connection that Don Kagan is talking about is sort of the thing that these neocons are brilliant at, and they're so good at it that it's almost like they manage to be able to do it without seeming obvious. Trump is taking a more obvious inflammatory approach. He's kind of dipping into this Fox News tool bag, which in a lot of ways was the neocon tool bag more, around like 2001 to 2005. I would say the neocons were very much in line with that. At a certain point, they decided to soften and sort of, like change the way that their rhetoric was put out there. it became a little more intellectual, became more nuanced, it became less strongly right wing and a little more, I guess, just better. Their rhetoric was, given sort of a 2.0 update, and I think it continues to get better and better. I mean, if you read the Robert Kagan article about how Donald Trump will bring fascism to this country, it's very, it's a very well written article that makes a lot of very convincing points, and in a lot of ways he manages to call Trump a fascist in a way that doesn't sound as reactionary and as sort of a knee-jerk response as a lot of these other people calling Trump a fascist. So they're very, very good at just sort of the sales pitch. And it's not an obvious sales pitch because it relies on a dynamic instead of just them being able to pitch directly to like an audience. Like, it's not them necessarily interfacing with the public. It's them bouncing around all these different, media outlets, fields of punditry, editorializing, and even influencing culture. I mean, Robert Kagan's books have been very influential in the way that policymakers even view themselves and their role in the American government. So there's also that component. It's a very it seems very complex, but to these neocons, they understand that you can play this sort of three-way connection between the media, domestic policy, and foreign policy, almost like an instrument. And if you learn how to play that instrument well enough and you practice it well enough, at a certain point, people can't even tell what you're doing. It just becomes that much of background noise. And to me, that's the most frightening part, is the better they get, the more it's just harder to tell what it is. It just kind of, it becomes part of the wallpaper and the cultural landscape.
Oh, and I think that also kind of, again, goes back to what's at the heart of this, which is this apocalyptic world domination. Sort of where they will pick up on anything, domestic, foreign, and the media, and they will constantly change whatever it is, because ultimately they're so intertwined with these three things, these three ideas, that they can achieve whatever they want, no matter what it is. I mean, and as you said, now you've got Robert Kagan, rebranding himself as a Hillary Clinton supporter, and it's rich him calling Trump a fascist when he's, this pro-NATO, pro-arms industry. The arms industry is funding, his brother and his sister-in-law. And, and he's basically, what he parrots is what Victoria Nuland parrots. So, he's certainly on the fascist side. But yeah, that's what's so interesting. That's what's so fascinating. And again, I don't think we'll kind of round off the conversation, but that's what's so terrifying with the neocons. And again, is what the point so well made throughout, especially this last in part 3, is that just they really are trucking along quite well. They're if anything now they're again kind of they're playing this intellectual card where they are morally superior. They understand the world better, and they're willing to, we got to support Hillary because Trump is that, sad evil. So I guess, Robbie, and kind of in closing and talking about this, I mean, there's a great interview at the end you have where you're talking about the idea that, if Hillary Clinton is the neocon choice, and I think she is, then she brings on Victoria Nuland as Secretary of State, Bob Kagan kind of on the outside, and you have this, what would that look like? How do you see the neocons kind of going forward, especially now that we're going to have a new president?
I mean, it's terrifying, man. It really is, because, Obama, did have sort of this, team of rival kind of dynamic going on in his administration, but he still managed to, Hillary by proxy, bring in the Kagans through Hillary. And it was his decision to choose Victoria Nuland as Assistant Secretary of State for Eurasian Affairs. There's no excuse for Obama making that choice. So unfortunately, the Kagans have their claws deeper into the U.S. government than ever before. And it's just, and I see it just getting worse under Hillary's presidency. And I believe that Robert Kagan is probably already advising her campaign unofficially, a shadow advisor. There's really no reason why he wouldn't be at this point. I'm actually going to a fundraiser on the 20th, where Robert Kagan will be there. It's a fundraiser for Hillary Clinton, hosted by Robert Kagan.
God.
And the thing is, he sort of, and it's interesting because you can even watch him not pushing his own think tank. If the past couple of years, maybe 2 or 3 years, he doesn't push his own think tank. He pushes, what is it? I think it's the Council for the New American Security. I might be getting the name wrong. Yeah. So it's a more neoliberal representation of sort of this America needs to, be the world's police force. And he wrote a new paper, which is in a lot of ways very similar to Rebuilding America's Defenses from the year 2000. But he wrote it for this neoliberal think tank with Eric Edelman and what's her name? Michelle Flournoy. Now, Michelle Flournoy is an interesting person because we talked about Zero Dark 30 on Tom and your Hollywood and the CIA podcast, but I think there's an interesting thing that kind of came up in that discussion we had, which is this weird propagandistic vibe of empowered, strong women, and sort of this what it means now to be like, masculinity sort of used to be interlinked with sort of this American hawkishness, but what happens when female empowerment gets mixed together with it, whether it's actually become some sort of weird quasi-introverted feminism where Hillary Clinton picks Victoria Nuland to be, say, Secretary of State and Michelle Flournoy to be Secretary of Defense. And man, you got a powerful trifecta of this like new feminist Democratic administration, new era. I mean, in a way, it can almost be more powerful than the Obama being the first black president. Like it had more of a symbolic meaning to people, more exciting to them, and so progressive, to have these two women. And I think that's a very strong possibility of how they could sort of get these two very hawkish, very think tank, neocon sort of females, to have them in her administration and then to present it as this amazing progressive thing. Yeah. And that's what I actually think that's pretty much going to happen. I wouldn't be surprised if there were even more, neocon or really hawkish females in her administration also. It's quite unfortunate that Hillary Clinton it's unfortunate that these are the choices we've been left with. And you got to vote for Hillary because Trump is so bad. I mean, that's kind of that's where it already is at this point. And it's just unfortunate, because people feel forced to choose one or the other without, and the reason it's unfortunate is because it just doesn't allow people to think critically about what her policies will actually be like. And I keep trying to remind people, no, she's not going to be another Obama term. All these supporters of hers keep saying that, and they believe it, just assuming that, she's on the same page as Obama. She's going to do more or less the same thing. Yeah, you complained about Obama's foreign policy, but he's so much better than all these other people. But what they don't realize is that Hillary is way more hawkish than Obama.
Yes.
By any measure. Her statements after she left, before she left, what she's voted on, there's no question that she is far more of a neoconservative and far more aggressive than Obama on foreign policy. She does not have the same qualms and arguably thoughtfulness when looking at if we're going to kill people across the world or not. I mean, so it's quite frightening, and I just think a lot of people who are voting for her, I can understand why people would want to vote for her just out of necessity, but I really think people, even if they're voting for her, should just do research to see what they're going to get, and it is not going to be the same as the Obama administration. It's going to be probably worse.
I think it's going to be closer to Bush than Obama was to Bush.
Absolutely.
It was quite close. But yeah, I think this is going to be, and again, I think this is the neocons were sort of shut out to some degree with Obama. And I think there was more of a, the kind of covert CIA stuff is more in his wheelhouse. But with Hillary Clinton, it's going to be, all neocons all the time. So yeah, very, very disturbing idea. Kind of on a more depressing note, but this is a very, important topic that needs to be discussed. Robbie, where can people go to watch part 3 as well as parts 1 and 2?
Well, right now we're just about to come out with a DVD of part 3, and you can buy that individually or in a box set. And the box set will actually come with a additional 30-minute bonus DVD,
Excellent,
which will go into subjects like Operation Dark Winter. I'm going to flesh out sort of the anthrax a little bit more. There will be some, there will be a longer version of the Matt DeHart interview, of the Don and Fred Kagan discussion from 9/12, so you can hear more of the full context of what they're talking about. So you can order those now, or you can watch it on demand, streaming, download right now. You don't have to wait for part 3. It's already online at averyheavyagenda.com. And on the right side of the page, I sort of have easy to see links to each part, and the DVD link and the video on demand for each one. And I should mention, because a few people have been a little bit upset about this, and I can understand because I put it up later. But there's a Very Heavy Agenda trilogy website on Vimeo. If you go to vimeo.com/on-demand/a Very Heavy Agenda trilogy, and I'm meaning to put this link out more, because you actually get about 40% off if you buy all 3 of them at once. So you buy the digital versions compared to buying them all individually. So just make sure that if you want to buy all 3 of them, you go there. Otherwise, you'll be spending about a lot more money. So
all right, excellent, and we'll of course link up to all of that in the show notes. I can't encourage people to go watch this more. I mean, it is such a great film series, and again, there's so many other little aspects we didn't get to. We'll have to talk again, and particularly about the anthrax stuff, because those are very much bookends to the whole trilogy, but very much bookends to part 3. Very fascinating stuff. Robbie, we were talking about that off air, but Robbie Martin, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast, and we will be talking to you very soon. Okay, everybody. Well, thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Porkins Policy Radio. If you enjoyed this podcast and you would like to hear some more of my work, then you can always go to porkinspolicyreview.com, where you can find this podcast and many more, all free for download. Well, I know this was a long episode, but we have a few things to take care of right now. The first of which is, of course, thanking all of my Patreon subscribers. That is right. If you are not aware already, I have a Patreon for Porkins Policy Radio, where you can donate a monthly sum of as little as $1 a month, and it helps me out a lot. I also have me and Christoph have a Patreon campaign set up right now for Porkins Great Game. So if you want to support that show as well, and that is not a monthly subscription, it is an episode by episode subscription. So you'll only be charged when Christoph and I put out an episode, which is great because Christoph and I have a habit of going a few months sometimes without an episode. But I would like to, of course, as I said, anyone that donates at least $1 to the Porkins Policy Radio Patreon gets a special on-air thank you. So I would like to give a big thank you to Sally, Jacob, Jacob F, Jacob W, Fabry, Walter, Peter, Pamela, Quentin, Arthur, Matthew, and Marianne. Thank you all so much for becoming Patreon subscribers. And I can't express how much it's been wonderful getting people subscribing, getting people messaging me on Patreon. It really does help a lot, and I'm so appreciative of all of that. Of course, for those of you that donated a whopping $3 a month, you get to ask me a question, which I will answer on air. And I'm a little sad to say I didn't get quite as many questions as I thought I would. I definitely had a few people that subscribed at the $3 and $5 donation. And you're all entitled to a question. I only, am again sad to say, I only got one question, but it is a very good question. And this comes from Jacob F., who writes to me, Pierce, have you read William C. Deer's O.J. is Innocent and I Can Prove It? If so, what are your thoughts? Do you think his thesis as to what actually happened can coexist with that of singulars and others? I am most fascinated by the notion that O.J. was innocent of the murders, but perhaps guilty on another level. In other words, is it possible he was getting framed and covering up for his son at the exact same time, simultaneous yet separate? And then he says, I hope that made sense. Well, it definitely did make sense to me, Jacob. For anyone that is unaware, William C. Deer is a private investigator who wrote this book called O.J. is Innocent and I Can Prove It. And there is a documentary film that was produced by the BBC, which is based on this. And he's quite well known in the O.J. research community. And he puts forth this theory that it was actually Jason Simpson, O.J.'s older son, that not a son that he, his mother was not Nicole Brown, but that Jason actually killed Nicole. And William C. Deer goes through a whole long explanation that this is because Nicole was supposed to go out to dinner at the restaurant where Jason was the head chef, and because she didn't and went to Mezzaluna instead, that Jason went over and butchered her, and Ronald Goldman as well, and then that O.J. either found out about this or something, and he sort of took the blame for this, and this was really about protecting Jason. Now, I will be very honest, I don't think William C. Deer's theory holds water whatsoever. I think it's a ludicrous explanation. There's a lot of evidence that points just in a totally opposite direction. Jason, while I believe he did have a record of, I'm not sure if it was quite domestic violence with his girlfriend, that he had anger issues. There just nothing holds up whatsoever with this. There's really no evidence to point out that Nicole was intending to go to his restaurant. I'm not sure exactly where William C. Deer gets this. And I'll say I've not read his book. I have seen I've seen the BBC film that documents this, and I've read a lot of William Deer's stuff, and I've seen interviews with him. But the essential problem that I have with this is that it just substitutes one, quote, angry black man for another angry black man. So instead of O.J., it's really Jason. And it just doesn't make any sense. His theory is that he had such a bad anger problem that when Nicole broke off her non-existent plans to go to his restaurant, he decided that he was going to kill her and Ronald Goldman, while of course his stepbrothers and sisters were sleeping upstairs. And that really is it. It really just doesn't make any sense. I think that Deer's thesis is also another way of avoiding the most obvious elephant in the room, and that is, of course, cocaine and drug trafficking and drug dealing and organized crime, which is very interconnected to the O.J. case in and of itself. So I really don't put any credence to what William C. Deer writes. I think Deer is really out to make a buck, like so many people that were either attached or later latched on to the O.J. Simpson trial. And he has made money off of this. He's made himself a name, but it doesn't really go towards explaining any of the other bizarre things. It still sort of begs the question of but why were they framing OJ? Why they go through the trouble of doing all these other things if they could just, if this really was, let's say, about, Mark Furman being a psychotic neo-Nazi nut job, then why not, frame this other black guy? So I don't really understand quite why people would even jump to the conclusion that it could be Jason. It just doesn't really make any sense to me. And again, I find almost all theories that diverge away from drug dealing to be a sort of, an escape route. And I don't think that it's necessarily that, William Deere knows something and he's covering for someone else. This is one problem that I have, the only real problem that I have with T.H. Johnson's research. And, Pursuit of Exhibit 35 is an amazing book that I definitely encourage everybody to read. But he goes with the Glenn Rogers serial killer explanation. And again, I think that just avoids the bigger question, which is, why was everybody around OJ and around Nicole involved in cocaine and organized crime? And I recently just read a great book called Killing Time, which is by Donald Freed and another writer. I want to say his first name is William, but I don't think it is. His last name is Briggs. Really great book. Excellent. Goes into a lot of the drug dealing angle to this, and there's a whole lot to it that I can't explain all on the in this Patreon question. I will be on Tim Kelly's podcast, Our Interesting Times, which should be out by the time you're listening to this, although it may take a few days. And we're going to be talking about O.J. Simpson, and I'm definitely going to get into a lot of the drug side of this. But in short, I don't think William C. Deere is really doing anything other than creating another scary black man to take the rap for OJ. Now, to kind of finish off with your question there, Jacob, in the idea that he was getting framed or covering up, but that OJ was guilty. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think that even when you get into a lot of the drug side of this, there is a tendency for a lot of people in the research community to kind of give OJ a pass on this. That, it was really just Nicole and Faye Resnick and Goldman, they were the cokeheads, and OJ was really just a good guy. If you listen to the stuff that Jeffrey Felix, who was a prison guard up at Lovelock Prison in Las Vegas, where OJ is being held, he says that that OJ told him that he had been, warned that Nicole had to pay off some drug debts and he didn't want to do it anymore, and then she was murdered. I think that's possible. I think that's a part of it, but I think that OJ was quite possibly more deeply involved in all of this because, again, there are so many people let's say outside of Nicole and Goldman's circle of friends, there are a lot of OJ circle of friends or acquaintances who were also killed around the exact same time as the Bundy murders were taking place. So I don't think that OJ is completely innocent of anything. I think that all of their actions did contribute to this. So that was a bit of a long answer. I hope that answered it for you, Jacob. I will be returning to this topic in the near future. So, obviously stay tuned for all of that. But, long and short of it, I don't buy anything that William Deere is selling. I think all he's selling is, he's just selling selling OJ. He's just trying to make money off the OJ Simpson case. He doesn't really have any actual good evidence, and he has no real explanation for a whole litany of other things that don't make any sense. I know there was a whole issue that, OJ got lawyers for his kids, including Jason, very early on. Given how deep he was into all of this, I don't think it's that strange that he might get lawyers for some of his kids. Who knows what Jason might have known? He might have known quite a bit more of what his father and his stepmother were doing in their free time. So not crazy to think that he might get a lawyer for them. But I hope that did answer your question, and I hope that everyone out there who is donating to Patreon will We'll send me in some more questions because I love to answer questions. I think it's a really fun way to connect with the listeners out there. So please, if you did donate $3 or $5 to my Patreon subscription, and here we go, we got another fire truck going right out my window. So we'll just take a minute there. If you did donate $3 or $5 a month, then please do send me a question. I would love to answer the questions on the show. And of course, for anyone that subscribed for $5 a month, there will be a bonus podcast that will be coming out very soon. I haven't really figured out the topic yet, but it might be something a little personal. It might not be like an interview or a look at anything. It might be a little, something a little bit more personal. You'll get to know me a little bit more, and I might even do it as a video podcast. So, of course, all of the people out there that subscribe to $5 will get that. I saw that there were some people that subscribed without a reward, but I'm gonna send you the podcast anyway. So I hope you enjoyed that. But without further ado, because I know I'm taking up quite a lot of time right now, I do have a very special announcement. The podcast, Porkins Policy Radio, will be moving to a live radio format on American Freedom Radio. So faithful listeners will know American Freedom Radio. That is a internet radio station that I have been on several times before. Ed Opperman hosts a show on Saturday afternoons or early Saturday evening on AFR. And of course, the great Chuck Ocelli does a live show from 9 or 8, I think it's 8 p.m. Eastern to 10. 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, and I've been on both of their shows many times before, and they offered me a spot there. I'm going to be on American Freedom Radio from starting this coming Tuesday, July 19th. The show is going to be broadcast to you live from 4 to 6 Eastern, so that's 1 to 3 Pacific. I'm really excited about it. Couple quick things. This is, it's a live show. It's 2 hours. It's every week. So the podcast is going to, kind of be put on hiatus, but it's not really going to be put on hiatus per se, because I'm essentially going to be moving the podcast over to AFR. So the name of the show on AFR is still going to be Porkins Policy Radio. You can still subscribe through Patreon. Of course, the bonus podcast on Patreon will continue. And I will be putting out, specific podcasts on Porkins Policy Radio as well. But essentially, most of the guests and the episodes that I would be covering on the podcast are instead going to be covered over on AFR. So, a little bit of a change. I think the style will be a little bit different because it is going to be a radio show, but I'm very excited about that. Faithful listeners will know I'm a big fan of radio, talk radio. Gene Shepard, the late great Gene Shepard, was a huge influence in my life, and he of course hosted a radio show for decades. So this has always been a dream of mine, and I'm very excited about it. AFR is a great station. Danny Romero over there, who is the owner and the producer. Big thank you to Danny. Big thank you to Ed Opperman for first, interesting people over at AFR. And a big thanks to Chuck Ocelli, who has not only had me on his show on AFR many times, but was instrumental in helping to get me a spot there. So just to recap, essentially, the podcast will now be a live radio show. Regular, Porkins Great Game will still be coming out every month, and we're hopefully going to, Christoph and I will hopefully be doing some of those episodes live on American Freedom Radio, and we might be doing some special interviews on AFR as well. But basically, podcasts will be over there. There will still be some regular podcasts that I'll do on the website, but of course, doing a live radio show every week is going to take up quite a bit of time, so expect that there. Everything, of course, will be mirrored on my website, so you can still watch the YouTube videos, you can still download the episodes, and they'll, of course, be on American Freedom Radio. So I hope that people will tune in live to listen. There is a chat room for AFR. You can even call in live on the air. So if you want to call in, if you want to yell at me, if you want to ask me a question, you can do all of that. I'm also going to be on Awake Radio. Ed Opperman has recently just sort of taken over duties and managing. He's a general manager now at Awake Radio. So I'm also going to be on Awake Radio. So that's also fantastic. A very exciting time right now for the podcast, and I'm really excited to be expanding it like this. But anyway, I have been talking for too long. So thank you all for joining me on the podcast, and hopefully I will be talking to you all very soon live on the air on American Freedom Radio starting this Tuesday, July 19th, and that is, of course, going to be 4 to 6 Eastern, 1 to 3 Pacific. So thank you so much for joining me.